has invited me to share my thoughts on this particular topic. I'm extremely thankful to our dear friend Randhir ji for facilitating this particular interaction, and my regards to Professor for sharing his thoughts in a very deliberate way so that we can understand and reflect more on this particular topic. So I basically like to share my thoughts on the fact that when we are discussing about the resurgent transformations which are taking place in today's timing, we also see how the entire world is going towards several kinds of conflicts and conflicts which are taking place at several levels of personal front, on societal front, on political front, on individual front, and in the front of collectivity. So as I have got the privilege to visit the World Sociology Congress inaugural session today at Melbourne, Australia, the topic which was discussed by the president of International Sociological Association, Professor Suri, was completely based on what are the consequences of late modernity and how sociology is dealing with all these kinds of conflicts and challenges in our day-to-day lives. So one of the most important aspect which he tried to cover upon was the emotional capitalism. And what he basically wanted to make us understand is when we are discussing about capitalism, that is a process in which we see that the profit orientation is always present. In today's time, emotion has also been covered with a kind of capitalism or with a kind of professional exploitation. It may so happen in the field of social media. It may so happen in the field of family life. It may so happen in the field of individual relationship or, cultural dynamics as well. So this kind of a exploitation or this kind of a relationship which is taking place in each and every front of our lives can be perhaps, addressed through a dialogical sociology. What he wanted to propose was perhaps a more space, as referred by Anthony Giddens, in terms of temporal and spatial facilitation. Similarly, if we give more space to individual, to collective groups, then perhaps we can create a dialogical sociology. And this dialogical sociology is going to open the doors to mitigate and reduce the conflicts and challenges which are taking place in our day-to-day lives. This was one of the most important part which he wanted to discuss with all of us, the international delegates who were present at the conference. And then he very systematically wanted to touch upon several issues of the alternatives which can be proposed to bear these kinds of challenging situations. So he took an example about how democratization is functioning in today's world. And he referred to tolerance of speech. So today, as our professor sir was referring, that in today's world, communication or a speech or articulation in any kind of forum, whenever it is taking place, it needs to be, in a situation where it is appealing to all, but it is not possible. As our professor was referring to Mahatma Gandhi, to Jayaprakash Narayan, and my own guru, Professor Kumar, all those who have acted and, practiced in their lives for socialism and all kinds of goodness, we see that whenever there is a kind of dialoguing or whenever there is a kind of addressal of a situation, we have to come out with the practical condition or the practical situation. But there are groups, there are categories, there are particular communities who are reluctant to tolerate the practical situation, or who are reluctant to accept what actually is happening in reality. So this is leading to several kinds of criminalization, several kinds of, universal human rights, and several kinds of hindrance to the social justice. So what Professor Suri today was trying to make us understand is the political and the social domain, which Habermas has, referred and made us understand that these domains are really getting hampered. And it's very, very difficult to find a particular space in which two individuals can have a healthy dialogue, because family members are insecure that if two members are having healthy dialogue, then perhaps there will be some disturbance in the other relations which are present. And this is also the situation of the country. If two communities are sharing their own ideas in their own naturalistic way, then other communities are insecure that, oh my God, there might be something cooking against us. So we must take immediately steps so that we can hinder them, we can, be violent towards them, or we can create some kind of emotional disturbance. So what Professor Suri tried to make us understand is, right starting from emotional capitalism to emotional security, to social justice, to universal human rights. And he tried to touch upon how universally the soft communication, which is taking place via social media, via telephonic conversations, via platforms of Zoom international interactions, which now we are trying to make. And what the professor who was trying to make us understand is, like, when we are having a dialogue with the larger audience, whom I don't know, whom he don't know, we cannot, apprehend about how we can shape our discussion, or how we can shape our opinions. And that's how a dialogue and a democratic dialogue should take place. But, in the other part of the planet, what is happening is everything is completely fixed. Everything is completely predetermined. If a new member comes to a family, the family members are so much burdened with the prejudices which the patriarchal society has given into their mind, that they cannot allow a healthy discussion between two people because they are insecure. In the nation level, same is the situation. There has been so much of prejudices in terms of several categories of, authoritarianism, on a kind of monarchical attitude, that they cannot give a space for healthy discussion for free and liberal communities. So basically what we understand is, today the whole planet and the whole society is going through a crisis situation. And this crisis situation is the consequence of the late modernity, what Ulrich Beck has explained in his work of Risk Society, that we all are going through the risk of industrialization, risk of societal modernization, risk of transition. All these risks are burdened on our shoulders. And we, the young generation people, and followed by our elderly professors and intellectuals and tanks of the society, need to stand for our own self. You know, putting all the insecurities and putting all the fears of our mind aside and keeping them locked in our own almiras, we have to come to the forefront, and we have to use forums like this Vishwaneedam forum, like forums with Professor Anand Kumar has created of GSDS, and other forums through which we can voice out the reality, come out of that, and in a way practice the multiculturalism which is supposed and proposed by Will Kemlika from Canada. So we have to come to a practice of multiculturalism, a practice of more wider and broader intellectual space for everyone, emotional space for everyone, in individual level, in family level, in collective level, in national and international level. Then probably what we are discussing today, we can make a justice to that, and we can bring a universal, equitable human rights, in a justified manner within all of us. That's all. That's all I wanted to share with this forum. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anant Bhai, for this opportunity. Thank you, Randhir.
So much, Dr. Sipra. Very, very deep, the very deliberation. And yes, you are very right. And while listening to your lecture, I was recalling Arnold of totalitarianism, which he explained like how people fall for totalitarianism or totalitarian parties and governments because of their social estrangement and loneliness. That is something which is also conceptualized by Pankaj Mishra, who is talking about that people are suffering from the trust deficits. Like people don't have communitarian trust. So they somehow colonized by fake communitarian faith-oriented parties. And that's how new sort of fascism also work in our everyday life. Thank you so much for giving a kind of insightful perspective to understand the case of anxiety in which we all of live. Now I request Ananta Bhai to share some of his reflection.
So thank you, Hans, thank you, Sipra. And so it is in this journey, and Professor Bakker's very important question: what is legitimate authority? And he challenged that domination is not the same, that is, it is commonsensically understood. That is very important. And Sipra's bringing to this whole space of dialogue and the space of emotions. And how do we, because this whole resurgent authoritarianism builds on a kind of unbridled emotions, like what has happened with President Trump or some political forces in India. And if we look at these emotions, are mainly, or one of the component of that emotion is revenge, or what, building on Nietzsche, the great political theorist Bill Connolly talks at resentment. But creating an emotional space is also a challenge of cultivation of emotions. And here we need to look at political emotions in a much more connected way, as Martha Nussbaum has suggested in her work on political emotions. And so, yes, we all have emotions, but how do we work with our emotions? And for example, in the indict tradition, Professor Bakker four dynamics of Sipra and Tam. Most of the emotions can be called as Tama. It comes from a very lower level and of human action. And so how do we move from a knee-jerk emotion to a space of cultivated emotions? And some challenges like, for example, authoritarianism and the challenge of suffering and the suffering and pain it creates. In the most immediate level, what is happening is this arbitrary authoritarianism is, for example, during the lockdown in India, we are just given 4 hours and the lockdown continued for 4 months and the devastation that it is created. So it could have been avoided if we had a much more consultative way of arriving at decision. So therefore, authoritarianism and the pain and suffering it creates, in a way, we also have to relate. Sipra talks about late modernity, but we are today in a hyper-modern mode. Professor Jit Oberoi wrote an essay many years ago called Technology of Obsolescence. Therefore, the technology of speed that is coming, because there is a kind of a theology of speed. We must do it faster. But democracy is not a theology of speed. It might take time to come at a consensus, but we must wait for that time. Similarly, science and scholarship, relating to Max Weber, his two important essays, Science as a Vocation and Politics as a Vocation. So therefore, what kind of politics and science that we need, so that it is not a prisoner of a technology of speed, which leads to obsolescence, and not only obsolescence, but annihilation, but to a politics and science of liberation.
Thank you, Ananta bhai. Now I request respected participant to share their queries and questions. So I would like to request Rahul Singh to start with the question. Yes, Rahul. Please.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Thank you, the distinguished speaker, Professor Bakker, for making it clear the how the ideas of Weber on patrimonial can be utilized in cases of studying various problems in India. And I particularly posed the question to Weber, which Bakker, Professor Bakker, which he has replied already, that we can use the idea of patrimonial of Weber to study the cases in India. And I was of the query that I had a query that in an Indian situation, when people talk about the increasing gap between the society, the rich becoming more richer and the poor becoming more poorer. So how the idea of authority can be even thought of in such situations where there is such a wider gap, and how this whole idea of authority can be rethought in such a situation where there is so much gap between the people in the society. And so also Professor Bakker was telling me that he doesn't have the actual idea. There was a recent Oxfam report about only 10% of richest Indian owning almost more than 50 to 60% of the national assets, and rest of the India is surviving on the rest of the asset. So in such a situation, how we think of authority in cases of India? We talk about that India is a larger democracy, but how this situation can be handled to Weber's idea? This was my question, which he has answered in the message. Thank you.
I request said I'll speak.
Can I speak? Would you like me to speak?
Yes, please.
Okay. In essence, I am not an expert on India today. I'm not an expert on India 50 years ago. I'm not an expert on Indian history. What I do know is that we tend to think of India as having the potential to be a representative democracy. I think it's always important to talk about a constitutional representative democracy and remember that the ideal of pure democracy doesn't work in a large country. There may have been times in history where small Greek or Italian city-state approached the idea of all male adult citizens with property having the right to vote. In ancient Athens, every male had to serve in the military. We forget that Socrates was a warrior. He was a fighter. You know, he wasn't Arjuna, but he fought in battles, and all of the great thinkers and philosophers took that as a given that men had to fight. And so the idea of a democracy is a very complicated idea. But if we compare India with China, in general, on average, at the very global level, India comes closer to having some heritage of democracy. Well, then we have to ask, why is that the case? Why is it that Xi is clearly an authoritarian ruler in terms of the journalistic use of the word authoritarian? Xi has legitimate authority according to a patrimonial prebendal model that was established by Neo-Confucian thinkers thousands of years ago. But the idea of ancient India immediately translating into contemporary India, which some thinkers tend to push, is not correct, because clearly a lot has happened in the last 5,000 years. And one of the things that happened is the Mughal colonial period, and you can talk about all the details of that. Another thing that happened is French, Dutch, and British colonialism in about half of what we can today consider the nation state of India. As you know, even at the height of British colonialism and imperialism, they didn't control the whole of the contemporary nation state of India. They had a certain notion of subalterns and, subaltern studies and all of that. So if the ordinary citizen of India is going to have a real role in the next 100 years, what you need is to push the idea of democracy and carefully study the history of representative democracy in England. I alluded to the fact that even England was not a representative democracy during most of the 19th century, which is part of what motivated Karl Marx. It only started to become a little bit more like a representative democracy in the purer sense in the early 20th century, especially after World War I and then again after World War II. So now it's taken for granted that the average citizen can vote, and a lot of people don't even choose to vote. But the more we push the notion of citizenships and voting, I think the better, because representative democracy is as close as we're going to get to people having a voice. So, the idea that we can liberate everyone in 10 years, it's just not going to work. A famous Dutch prime minister that most people have never heard of if they're not interested in Dutch history, made it clear that to work as a political party, you had to have a party infrastructure. And of course, Lenin famously said the same thing about the Bolsheviks in what became the Soviet Union. So you have to work through parties, you have to work through political parties. And that requires honesty. So a fundamental rule that is so common in Buddhist and Hindu philosophy is honesty, integrity, standing up for your rights. And that's what I admire so much about Gandhi. That's what I admire so much about Ambedkar and so many other great Indian thinkers. And so we have a real problem, I believe, with honesty. And this is closely related to the notion of emotions. You know, when people are very honest, then they express emotions, but when people express emotions in a common sense, everyday life way, they can often be in horrific arguments because they've now used the terminology in ways that leads to what I call a reified binary, you know, a polarized opposition, good versus bad. You're bad because I'm good, you know. So these are not simple issues that can simply be dealt with in a 1 hour or 2 hour seminar. But it is true that if we look back to the history of England, the emergence of representative democracy had a lot to do with feudalism. And I've been having this argument in a scholarly level with a lot of people. See, I make a distinction that most Weberians don't make between patrimonial prebendalism and patrimonial feudalism. I think a prebendal situation is where a traditional bureaucracy is totally at the beck and call of the patrimonial ruler. And so the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy today is a patrimonial prebendal system. Now, it's only an echo of what it was in the 13th century, but in a general sense, it's the way it is. Whereas when in the 13th century and again in the 14th century, the various barons, the aristocrats, the very, very rich aristocrats opposed the divine power of the ruler, they had to make a shift. They had to go from a pure patrimonial prebendal system, I'm speaking in ideal type model terms, to a pure ideal type model patrimonial feudal system or something approaching that. And then King Henry VIII, for all his faults, dropped out of the whole Roman Catholic Holy Roman Empire system to establish a notion that the church in England was not going to be led by the Pope in Rome, but led by the king in basically different parts of England at the time. So if I think these questions can only be answered, as I've said before, in a comparative historical sociological way. And I'm frustrated sometimes by an article that might take data from, let's say, 2019 to 2020 and reach sweeping conclusions. That's only a little tiny slice. We need to get the big picture to really talk about these big issues, like democracy, emotions, security, what happens in a family, what is poverty. You know, in the United States, people who are considered poor are very rich. When I compare them to people in Indonesia, I'll stick with Indonesia because I know that best. So, okay, my first wife and I spent a year in India, and we started to adjust a little bit. We always stayed in Gandhian ashrams, almost always. Very rarely did we stay at a one-star hotel. So we're in the ashrams, we're getting used to the lifestyle. We come back to Canada, and we had a real cultural shock because of the wealth in Canada. And then we bought a house, and we thought we were living in a mansion. We thought we were in a real mansion. As time went on, and as I talked to my local friends, they had all kinds of negative comments about the shack that we were living in. But we were applying sort of an Indian standard. Now, I don't mean I was living like a Gandhian. When we first came, we would try to do third-class trains. Then we figured third class wasn't so good, second class. At the end of our stay, we were using first-class air conditioning because to get from A to B and then be productive, sometimes it wasn't so great to be on a third-class train, given our cultural heritage, given our life cultural expectation. Okay, so to live like a real Gandhian, and I've met so many wonderful Gandhians the year I was with the Gandhi Peace Foundation, is difficult. But an example, I'm sorry, I had a colleague, and he was a bureaucrat in the government, and he and his wife invited us to their home. Now, he was, in my mind, when I met him, a rich man, rich in the sense of a middle-class rich man, not a super rich man. So we got there. His house was the most basic apartment that I've ever, well, not that I've ever seen, but it was very basic. There was no refrigerator. There was no stove. There was no, electric lighting. It was like so basic. And his wife cooked a beautiful meal on a charcoal pit. And I thought, wow, yeah, this is a bureaucrat who's making a good living. So poverty, I feel very, very, very bad for people who make less than $1 a day, less than $2 a day, less than $3 a day. And that's why I did the book, The World Food Crisis. When I did that book, I told the editorial staff, I didn't want the title World Food Crisis. I said, the crisis will be over. This book won't be any good. Well, I was wrong. The World Food Crisis has not ended. And I've given a lot of money to various organizations, but I mean a lot in terms of my own salary for the problems that have occurred in East Africa. I'm rambling a little bit too much, but these are big issues and they require big answers that are comparative, historical, sociological analyses, and careful scholarship, careful looking at data, careful attention to details. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you for even listening to all this.
Hoping this
I
insightful.
request Professor Gyan to say us about his reflection. And maybe the last.
Yes.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I was reflecting. It was very brilliant, very complex. And so it needs also a reflection. I would say as regards, it needs a very deep reflection, but as regards authoritarianism, what I think is that perhaps not in all countries, it depends on countries, it depends also on continents, but what I see in some countries is, and what worries me personally, is that there is the tendency to weaken the parliament and the discussion in parliament while charging commissions, technical commissions with duties which once were a duty of the parliament, or at least of members of parliament. This can be seen in different parliaments in Europe, but I would say not only in Europe. There is this tendency to strengthen the force of the executive and to weaken the force of the parliament, of the assembly. And we can see this also in some reforms. For instance, I'm thinking in this moment, but it is not the only example of, for instance, some reform in France in which practically the parliament has been adequated to the presidency, so that there is no difference in power between parliament, majority in power in parliament, and majority and the president of the republic. Once it was not so, but now it is very difficult that there is a difference in the composition. And so to the advantage of the executive, and it is, in my opinion, it is a danger when the parliament is weakened. And the second problem of authoritarianism, which I see in these last years, is this tendency to the technocracy. This also is not something which is spread all over the world. We must make a difference, but at least in some countries, there is a tendency to say only technocrats know, and therefore only technocrats can speak, and all the rest of the people must be silent, must remain silent, which is not the last shot of democracy, in my opinion, because, well, technocrats can be heard, but the responsibility to judge the directive policy of a country should always belong to the people, that is, to the vote. There is, for instance, the tendency to say always more and more in the television, but not in television, to say on this subject, people should not speak, on this subject, people should not vote. One example was the Brexit, for instance. I do not want now to take a position against Brexit or pro-Brexit, but at the time of the Brexit, many people said, many technocrats said, on this subject, people should not vote. And this convinced me not so much. It is, how can we establish on which subject people should vote, could vote, may vote, or may not vote? This is, in my opinion, the most, there are two aspects. One is the weakening of the parliament, and the second one is the power of technocracy, which is stagnating. There's this tendency to extend the power of technocracy, and at the same time to say people on this subject, people is not competent enough. Therefore, this subject should be outside the range of decisions of the people. This is a great danger, in my opinion. Let's think what could happen if this tendency grows and grows. Which subject remains for the people to decide on? This is, in my opinion, the great problem which we will confront it with over the next years. But anyway, it was really very interesting, and I thank you very much for both brilliant expositions from which I could learn very much, and I will have to reflect on very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gyan. It's always very deep. I would like to say my submission. It is very difficult to question, people's understanding. Like one of the very famous philosopher from America, Paul Bouchier, pointed out that capitalism is spreading like a tumor in American society, and the key is got out its ability to conceive people that there is no other alternative. Like people believe that markets should govern all social life. The government's only role is to protect the benefits of the businesses at the interest of super rich. So the question is like how we can invite people to contest, even not only in terms of praxis, but even in terms of idea. We are not able to give a kind of informed public opinion that people are not ready to fight for their right. When Hannah Arendt once told that there is no democracy without an informed public. But we are getting a lot of challenge. Find agencies which can bring informed public. So how do we find the agencies? If Professor Hans can say some of his reflection. Yes, Professor Hans.
I'm not sure what happened here. How we find the agency, is that a question directed specifically to me?
Yes, yes. How do we find the agencies?
I believe in education. I believe in higher education. I believe in very good quality higher education. So I'm very privileged to speak to members of this audience, many of whom are highly educated, obviously. And I'm very angry at the way in which in the United States today, the idea of formal university education has become something that people don't want to accept. So I definitely understand that formal education in and of itself is only one variable. But I'm 76. It's taken me, well, I guess I could say 76 years to become a little bit informed. So what has often happened in history is people make decisions with a lack of real understanding about what those decisions imply. Someone like, I'm not sure if I pronounced his name correct, Gianluigi Segalerba, is that close? Is very well informed. I'm very impressed by his scholarship. And I know that Ananta Giri is very well informed. And so I would hope that more very well informed people could also be members of parliaments and Congress in the United States. Unfortunately, the two things work against each other. So if you want an egalitarian democracy and you want to have everybody participating in representative democracy, then you will get some people who are not well informed because they can cater to popular opinion and get voted into the Congress or Parliament. But in the long run, the very rich and the not very but still quite rich people have to understand their own long-term self-interest does not involve being so rich that they can buy any luxury they want. They have to understand, and I've tried to, I've had these discussions with people who are much richer than I am. You have to understand their own long-term interest is to have a country that is a representative democracy. One of the successes of Canada is we are very much a multicultural country. I'm very proud that the head of the New Democratic Party, of which I'm a member, is a Sikh. I mean, that wouldn't happen in the United States, I think. There are some people in the Congress now who are not traditional Protestant Christians, but we have to be open to other cultural groups. We have to be multicultural. We have to push for egalitarian representative democracy. At the same time, we have to also encourage education. And that's very much a long-term situation, very much a problem that isn't solved in one decade. And I very much have discouraged my undergraduate students from spending all their time demonstrating and being activists. I've said, you know, it's good to be an activist. It's good to demonstrate. It's good to stand up for what you believe, but don't leave the library. Don't stop reading. Don't stop listening to podcasts, you know, and always discuss what you believe with other people. Be open to correction. I'm often wrong. I think it's very important to point out, and I hope everybody understands this, that I understand that I'm often wrong. And so it's been a long-term process of not only becoming more educated, but also learning the ways in which I was miseducated at various stages of my life by various things. So I don't know, there's no easy answer to your question. I'm trying my best to just sort of flounder about here to try to begin to answer a very, very complicated question.
Thank you so much. Now it's time to offer vote of thanks. So we have 1.5 hour session.
I can mention that I wanted to run for parliament. I became a preferred candidate. I went to a training session for the New Democratic Party. I was going to be the candidate, and then I learned the real reality of politics at the writing level. And I didn't have the opportunity to formally become a candidate, but I wanted to learn about politics, and I learned. It's a dirty game. It's a difficult game. It's not honest people having honest discourse. So sometimes wonder how any really well-educated, honest, perceptive people rise to becoming a senator or a member of parliament, etc. And so that's also a big problem that we have to deal with. Honesty among politicians is not common.
That is why I am attending this session from Gandhi Peace Foundation. And this is the room of Jayaprakash Narayan. And he said that there are two ways of doing politics. One is Lokaniti, another one is Rajniti. So Gandhi, Vinova, Jayaprakash Narayan, they all belong to a tradition of Sattvic politics. And that is a very spiritual kind of politics. without being corrupt, you cannot win the public opinion. So, but there is also another way of doing politics. That is Indian way of Mahatma Gandhi, Vinoba, Jayaprakash Narayan, and everything. So thank you so much. It was really very enriching session and very insightful. So on behalf of the Vishwaneedam Center for Ocean Listening, yes, Ananta Bhai wants to say something.
Yes. So a very prayerful and beautiful birthday to you, dear Hans, Professor Bakker.
Thank you. Thank you.
And from our community of friends, and we are very grateful to you for your contribution, for the journey of your life, and many roads and paths that you are cultivating, and we'll cover some of this journey together. Our best wishes and prayers.
Thank you. So
Namaste.
happy birthday and namaste. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving this time. I also extend a very warm, I would say grateful thanks to Dr. Sipra Raji, Professor Gyan Gumui, Professor Mohanty, Ananta Bhai, and all friends, all participants both on Facebook and Zoom. We look forward for your kind participation in our coming dialogue on every Sunday. Thank you so much. It was a very enriching session. Thank you, Professor Randhir.